Former Attorney General Eric Holder, a trailblazer in law. He served in government for 3 decades. He was a prosecutor fighting corruption by politicians in both parties, served as a judge, appointed by Bill Clinton to be the prestigious D.C. U.S. Attorney, and President Obama tapped him to be the United States Attorney General. At the time, he was the first Black American to hold that position and has been a tireless advocate in and out of government for civil rights and equality under the law. He has been recognized in many different ways. We will just mention one tonight. Time magazine named him one of the most influential people in the world, dubbing him the Justice Seeker. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, is our guest on the Summit Series. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Ari.
As we do around here in this series, I'd like to run it back to the beginning.
Okay.
When you were about 9 years old, you were watching this bright, new president being sworn in. Is that right?
I did.
And I read that you remember that even at that young age, which means you might have been a little more civically inclined than the most random average 9-year-old, perhaps. Depends on what you're interested in. But let's take a look at that very inaugural that you watched as a kid.
In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty.
What do you remember about that speech at that young age?
I remember a big black and white TV in the basement of our house in Queens and watching that speech and for some reason being inspired. I didn't really have a good sense of who John Fitzgerald Kennedy was. I remember thinking that day, Fitzgerald's kind of a weird middle name. And it's something about that speech moved me. You know, the notion of a torch being passed to a new generation of Americans, this notion of responsibility that each American has to make the nation better, to work with government, the notion of an alliance for progress that America would reach beyond its borders. There was a vitality to the speech and to him. And I, from that day forward, have been a devotee, a lover of all things John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
And so you said there you are in New York.
Mm-hmm.
You make it to Columbia, which is a great school. I think we have the yearbook photo. Tell me about this young man, and is he committed to law at this point?
I'm not sure what that young man was committed to, but I can say that my father told me, son, you are going to look back at this picture at some point, and you're going to look at the way you look right now and think that you look like a fool.
Okay, you brought it up. How do you feel about how you look there?
Well, I'd say that fro was a little excessive. I had the Walt Frazier sideburns, and those I think can still hang just a bit. But I would cut down that afro more than a little bit. And thank you so much for finding that picture, Ari.
Yeah. So does this young man at Columbia know that he wants to go into law and justice yet, or not?
No. If you had told the young Eric Holder, both in college and in the immediate, my first few years in law school, that I was going to be a federal prosecutor,
mm-hmm.
I would have said drug test time. I was a kid born in the 50s, raised in the 60s. Anti-establishment took over the Naval ROTC office when I was a freshman in college. And the notion that I would be working for the federal government as a prosecutor was something that I thought would never, ever happen.
Yeah, and that at the time, and still to this day, is not only often a more traditional space. I'm not going to say it's 100% right-leaning, but it's within law a little more conservative, mm-hmm. small c. And then there's the diversity dynamics, because today we checked, roughly 35% of law school graduates are minorities in some way. There's this diversity shift. Mm-hmm. In the 70s, when you were going through law school, it was less than 9%. Is that how you remember it? And how did that affect the way you identified within that community and then thinking about going into law?
Yeah, relatively small number of people at Columbia Law School, people of color. We all knew each other, and we knew each other quite well because we could all gather in one half of one room and talk about whatever our experiences were. We talked about the kinds of things that we wanted to do. And I came up with the idea that, you know, if I wanted to affect change when it came to the criminal justice system, I could probably have a greater impact by being on the inside of the system as opposed to being a defense attorney where I was really only, you know, standing for the rights of an individual charged with a crime.
And I'm going to jump in to annotate what you're saying. You're saying you could be on the inside and do reform.
Yeah.
As you know, we can name names or not, but there are other people who have said that and then pretty much run the same playbook. I'll just say, as a lawyer and journalist who covers this, that wasn't you. In other words, we hear that sometimes, and then they run the same playbook. You went in and throughout your career, including when you really had the ball at AG, and did reform. So for people looking at you going up that route, how much did you have to initially compromise, fit in, double prove your legitimacy, even though it's unfortunate that that sometimes seems to be the bar? And then was there a time when you started to push and shift more, or how would you put it?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I didn't go into the Justice Department as a newly hired lawyer and say, all right, I'm here to change everything. Right. I mean, I had to, you know, earn my stripes and try some cases. I went into a thing called a public integrity section that prosecuted official corruption cases. And over time, I got to develop a reputation as a person who knew his way around a courtroom. And at that point, I had the ability to start advocating for, well, who are we charging? Why are we charging?
So your credibility came first from doing and winning some cases?
Yeah.
And then questioning the priorities to some degree?
Right.
And we have, like, Abscam was a big case you worked on, right?
Right. Abscam was a case that I worked on and left because I didn't think the way in which the government was conducting itself in the component of Abscam that I was working on with a guy named Reed Weingarten was being done appropriately. And we said, we're not going to do it. And they took us off the case at our request.
So did you fear professional consequences for that?
By then, I was a pretty well-known commodity within the public integrity section. I had a good relationship with the person who was the chief of the section. And although I'm sure he was quite mad at me, and I know he was mad at me, it didn't really affect the trajectory of my career at the department.
How many years in was that?
I'd say this is probably about 7, 8 years or so in. I stayed there for 12 years.
So is there a Holder rule book here? If you're doing it in the first 2 years, you might be out of line. If you wait 20 years to ever stand up,
Right.
you might never change a thing?
Yeah, there's a right time. I mean, you've got to establish yourself as a person whose voice is worth listening to, but you don't want to stay too long so that you are simply dismissed when you do raise your voice.
Public integrity means going at both parties. That doesn't seem to be the easiest way to quickly make a name for yourself in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, that was the nature of the public integrity section. We tried Democrats, we tried Republicans. I was in the public integrity section for 12 years and ultimately decided that I thought, you know, I've done the stuff in the courtroom from this side. I think I want to try to be a judge. And luckily, what happened was that Bill Clinton, when he came in, said, we're going to form up a commission to pick the next, a judge here for the D.C. Superior Court. And I simply applied and was judged by the commission to be a person qualified to be a judge.
By the time President Obama tapped you to be the Attorney General, one thing going in your favor was you seemed to have his trust throughout, and that meant that you could do the job. There's the independent DOJ job. You're not supposed to pre-clear things. You're not supposed to be Nixonian and buddied up. But you could also do criminal justice reform policy, which is a tricky dance for anyone, let alone the position you and the first black president were in. We have you announcing here some of what you called then that smart on crime reform, which initially, for a period of time, as we've discussed, had some bipartisanship. I think in this recent MAGA era, maybe less. But let's look back at you pushing that reform.
Okay. By targeting the most serious offenses, prosecuting the most dangerous criminals, directing assistance to crime hotspots, and pursuing new ways to promote public safety, deterrence, efficiency, and fairness, we in the federal government can become both smarter and tougher on crime.
What resistance did you run into? What worked? And what is left undone?
You know, what surprised me about the announcement of the Smart on Crime initiative that's in San Francisco at an ABA meeting was the, I won't say universal, but really overwhelming amount of support that I got, both within the Department of Justice from some grizzled old veterans and from outside the department. There was a recognition that things needed to change, that the war on drugs had put too many people in too many jails for far too long for no good law enforcement reason. And by putting in place these reforms, which were always designed, first and foremost, to make sure we kept the American people safe, but to make sure that the system was perceived as being fair and that there was not a tension between fairness and safety, that generated a lot of support. And I was kind of surprised to see people from the right, people from the left, all saying, yeah, this made a great deal of sense. And so I was kind of surprised at the amount of support that we got. And one of the things I'm most proud of in my time as Attorney General.
While you were Attorney General, the first time we sat down was exactly a decade ago. We might have looked a little different. But that was one of the things we focused on in that discussion. We were actually on the site of a drug diversion type court. And I want to play some of what you said, because you were talking about how you wanted to ultimately be assessed, and now we're in the position to look back on it. Let's take a look.
I would hope that one of the things that people look back on and say that we got right was to do things in a different way. As we have used that phrase, to be smart on crime. And that necessarily means engaging in prevention activities, rehabilitation activities, reentry activities that ultimately keep the nation safer, to have a system, a criminal justice system, that is perceived as being fair and that acts in proportionate ways.
I'll give you my back of the envelope, and then you do yours. Yours matters more than mine. It would seem that you got progress in Congress. It laid the foundation for actually some bipartisan bills that were then passed after you and Obama left office. And we all know the political games in D.C. Sometimes people say, oh, we'll wait around, but we want more credit for that. But the fact that they wanted credit for that, even on the right, I think is progress. It would seem on sentencing and war on drugs, there's been progress. On police brutality, and the frontline first interactions with police, in the case of federal law enforcement, FBI, it seems that very little has fundamentally changed. That's my quick and dirty, but you tell us yours.
Well, I'd say that we certainly made progress when it came to making sure that we had more fairness in drug prosecutions, a greater focus on those people who posed the greatest danger to society. When it comes to the relationship between police and the communities that they're supposed to serve, I don't think we made as much progress as I would have liked.
Why is that?
A lot of stuff is ingrained in both cultures. There are stereotypes that too many in police have about communities that they serve, and in particular, communities of color. And there are, within those most distressed communities, I think an ingrained, but maybe legitimately ingrained fear of the system and the way in which people of color, Black people in particular, have not been treated fairly. Tried to bring those communities together with a modicum of success. We brought more cases against more police departments than ever had occurred before and have occurred since. And I think that was a significant step forward, but we didn't get to the place at the conclusion of my time as AG where I wanted to be in that regard.
Interesting. And as you say, you have those mechanisms, including trying to take more oversight of police departments. But everyone knows from civil rights history, that is a remedy sometimes needed, but has its own costs and trade-offs, especially when you talk about the tradition of local control and chafing and how long people want to deal with that. The national figures, as you know, but I'm reminding the audience, are combined. So it's not just any attorney general's oversight. It's a lot of local police. But I'm going to show the problem in a second. But if you talk to people casually, it's kind of like this DEI conversation. There's a lot of just loose talk. And that's how it is about BLM. We've heard since BLM people saying, enough already. I'm quote unquote tired of hearing about it. We're overdoing it, right? As if police are so afraid to act. OK, those are, as you know, words. But let's look at the data. Because when you look at the police interactions, for example, and we have this graph, fatal police shootings here, over time, have not budged much, and they are up basically over time. So police are continuing to use force and deadly force at the same or higher levels as before, and disproportionately in communities of color. That, to me, is a line, a data set that completely contradicts the notion of, oh, we're overdoing it the other way. Police are afraid to draw their guns. No, they're not. So why is that part so intractable? You just talked about some of the reasons, but could you get to a level where you deal with that, and is the only solution trying police officers, which again is an important thing if they've gone that far. But what about reducing what in law we call bad shots? Might not be a crime, but the gun should have not gone off in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole emphasis on prevention that I think we need to focus on when it comes to police activity. Police are just like any other people in this country who carry around with them stereotypes, implicit biases. They see people of color in a different way than they will see people who are white. Not all, but some police officers, too many police officers. And so dealing with those implicit biases and the actions upon those implicit biases are things that I think that we have to get at. Now, a lot of this stuff is not popular, particularly popular in law enforcement circles. And
because?
Well, because it means changing the way in which people do things. It means saying that the way in which you have been doing things may not be appropriate. And that's why I think when you're the Attorney General of the United States and you have a bully pulpit and actually you have funding power, it's important upon you to use the power that you have for the betterment of the way in which law enforcement conducts itself, which ultimately has a positive impact on the criminal justice system.
But just to be crisp, it's also unpopular because the majority sees the police protecting them and doesn't think they're going to be necessarily a victim this way. And the minority, especially in what you discuss, over-policed and often diverse communities, has a different experience.
Yeah, the experience that people in well-to-do communities, people who are white, is fundamentally different than what people who are Hispanic and who are poor, who are African-American, the perceptions that they have of the police are fundamentally different, and they are historically grounded. Yeah. I mean, this is not something that I'm just making up and saying because I happen to be a black kid from Queens who was mistreated by the police on a couple of occasions. This is something that the statistics show us and that our history is a guide to.
I want to show Senator Lindsey Graham, not because he's just extreme, but because I think the evidence shows he knows better. He was a very smart attorney, military JAG attorney. He used to work more on compromise stuff in certain areas, like the complex questions about Guantanamo, as you remember that era. But nowadays, if officer shoots, in this instance we're going to show you, an unarmed black man immediately, Lindsey Graham says, I don't know why he didn't yield. And then when his political allies, like President Trump, are put through a judicial system, and no one's talking about any use of physical force of any kind, but a multi-month peaceful process, he's outraged. And we've seen this. The double standard is so extreme. So very briefly, here is Republican Senator Graham on those two issues.
I don't know why the gentleman did yield when he was asked to yield. If they try to prosecute President Trump for mishandling classified information, they literally will be riots in the street.
You dealt with a lot of these folks when you were in office. Are they movable, or politically you just eventually have to hope they're replaceable?
I think that some of what you heard there is so ingrained and perceived as politically advantageous that you have to remove the people who are in office and who say those kinds of things. It's unfortunate to see Senator Graham, a person who I worked with when I was Attorney General, transform into the Lindsey Graham of today. In some ways, he's almost unrecognizable to me.
You've seen that shift?
Oh, there's no question.
And that's him just responding to the MAGA politics of the new era?
Yeah, I suppose that's what right? generated the shift. But there are some people up there who I think in Congress and in state legislatures who want to do the right thing. But too many other people, it's why we called the initiative the Smart on Crime initiative as opposed to the Tough on Crime approach. Tough on crime is something that people tend to think generates votes. That's the way in which a politician thinks that he or she gets reelected. It's, you can check the box, we'll run against crime, we're going to be tough on crime, we're going to have greater numbers of sentences, we're going to put more people in jail, and do it in an unthinking, irresponsible, inefficient way. Which engenders in the communities that are most impacted by this distrust. And these are the very people who you need to, when you need witnesses to crimes, when you need people to serve on juries, then you ask them, well, trust the system, when in fact the system has never done anything to generate the kind of trust that you now seek from those very communities. Yeah.
The President Obama really seemed to value your efforts on that. And, we're not going to relitigate the times of the speculation, were you his heat shield? Were you this other role? But when it's all said and done, Barack Obama, you could correct me if you want, but, you know, he's not known as warm and fuzzy to everybody. Democrats on the Hill constantly complain that he didn't do enough of the political shout-outs. And I say that by way of introduction of whatever reason, he seemed to really value and shout out your work. So given that we're here on the Summit Series, let's take a look at that.
Eric has served at the Justice Department under 6 presidents of both parties. Through it all, he's shown a deep and abiding fidelity to one of our most cherished ideals as a people, and that is equal justice under the law. Hundreds of terrorism convictions, the largest mafia takedown in history, billion-dollar financial fraud cases, long overdue reforms to our criminal justice system. With Eric Holder as its lawyer, America has become a better country.
Here's the summit question. What portion of that was the experience you had that you could apply? And what portion was knowing you had the trust of your boss, which many people don't have at any level of a job?
I think there are 3 portions to it. One was the experience that I had. Another portion was the backing that I had of this president. I think we share a worldview when it comes to a lot of these issues. And the third part is about, you know, who I am as a person, how I was raised, and the era in which I was raised. I'm a kid of the 60s. You know, when I was growing up, the civil rights movement was in full bloom. African countries were getting their independence. My parents are from the West Indies. Barbados becomes independent in 1966. And this notion of fairness, of justice, of equality is something that has infused me as an individual and has infused all parts of my professional career. So that desire for justice and equality with a great boss and with, I think, a good amount of experience is what allowed me, I think, to make some, you know, some significant progress in the things I focused on.
It's interesting. You mentioned the era and also your personal background. We often are told the black experience in America is not a monolith, and then everyone tends to treat it like a monolith. You're referencing, for example, the Afro-Caribbean history. The president, which many people know, has the African and white American history. And a lot of the biggest problems in the American South reflect the much older history of people who were descendant of slaves. And nowadays, it's hard for people to talk about any of this, and yet we have to be knowledgeable about all of it, hopefully. So what did that arm you to see anew, and what else did it force you to see differently? Because I presume from your answer that your experience and what you bring to the situation, equality for all, but a different personal experience than someone who might be 4 generations deep in Alabama.
You know, it's interesting. That's oftentimes the thought that West Indians have different experiences than black folks in the South. But the reality is we all come from a slave background. You know, I've done an autobiography that I'm working on, and my great-great-grandfather, you know, was a slave on both sides, not unexpectedly. And yet, I did my junior paper at Columbia to look at the West Indian experience in Harlem, close to where Columbia was. And as I looked at some of the original information, data that I saw then in newspapers, West Indians were called black Jews in a very derisive way because we were the people who owned shops. We were the people who were seen as striving with regard to education. There was
so you're saying sometimes the word Jew is used derisively in world history?
I know you find that shocking, yes, but I found this in my research. And there has been that dichotomy, that tension. And yet the reality is we all spring from the same thing. Slavery in Barbados was brutal, much more brutal in some ways than that which was experienced in the South. And yet,
but let me ask you about that, because if you are, though, in a region that has overthrown colonialism to a more full degree, that would be different than the American experience, where people are still trying to put up the battle flag, or it's still flying on capitals long after you were working at DOJ.
Yeah, and that is, in fact, the difference. As brutal as slavery was in the West Indies, it came to an end sooner, and black people in the West Indies had the ability to control their lives far sooner than African Americans did here in the United States, and probably still control their lives to a far greater degree in the West Indies, where we have Afro-Caribbeans who are, prime ministers and running governments in those places. So yeah, the experiences, in fact, differ, although they have their roots in the same place.
Yeah. Representation and the sometimes boring-sounding redistricting or gerrymandering. Of all the things you could do, and we just showed some of your level, this is what you're focused on right now. Why, and what are you doing?
Well, one of the things that I really focused on when I was Attorney General was the protection of voting rights. And I made the determination that in my post-government life, I wanted to continue that work. And I really decided to look at that which was most pernicious in our country with regard to voting. And I determined it was the problem of gerrymandering, the packing of people into districts, or the cracking of people from districts, such that you dilute the power of the American people, and you have politicians picking their voters instead of voters choosing who their representatives ought to be.
So the way you put it right there is how, in the world of culture and comedy, that's how Trevor Noah, who I think is such a gifted communicator, he put it slightly similarly. Take a look.
Okay. With gerrymandering, the politicians choose their voters. The voters don't choose them. And that's weird. It's back to front. It's like getting to your Uber and then your driver's in the back seat and he's like, "Start driving, I'm late."
That idea that this is backwards, have you been able to get that across to the public when there's so many other things people are obviously concerned about?
Yeah, I think we have. We've raised the consciousness of people about the importance of gerrymandering. We have a component that's called All on the Line, which is focused on mobilizing people at the grassroots level to care about this issue. We've brought lawsuits that we have won in state courts, in the United States Supreme Court.
Let me show you some of those, and when you talk about the different states, because on the one hand, you are winning some of these suits.
Right.
On the other hand, it can feel like this endless whack-a-mole. Here's what Politico put together: Georgia, Louisiana, New York, South Carolina, Florida, Utah, Kentucky, North Carolina. This is a whole bunch of places where this is constantly going on. Is there any wider solution than the whack-a-mole?
Well, I think under the present system that we have, it's going to be incumbent upon us to continue to bring these lawsuits. We're in an era of perpetual redistricting. It doesn't happen on just a every 10-year basis. We're still in the process of doing what should be the 2021 redistricting. So we bring lawsuits. We also are supporting candidates who are important in the redistricting process. And yeah, but there is a solution. I mean, that was the John Lewis bill that was before the last Congress that would have banned partisan and racial gerrymandering. As a result of the filibuster, however, it could not get through the Senate, though it had been passed by the Senate. President Biden said he would have signed it, but we couldn't get a sufficient number of people, including Democrats, to have a carve-out to the filibuster.
So what do you need there? Do you need a kind of a mass people's movement to get that to the level where there's enough pressure to, as you said, do a carve-out? They've done that for judges. A lot of people think this is as important to the issues as judges are.
Yeah.
Is that what you need? What's the alternative?
Well, I think the carve-out would be the ultimate thing, but I think before we get to that, we've got to continue to do the things that we have done. And as I said, that is to bring lawsuits, to support candidates who will stand for fairness, to mobilize the people. And this is really a movement about fairness. This is not an attempt to gerrymander or to put our thumbs on the scale for Democrats. All I want to do is have a system that is fair. And if it's fair, Democrats and progressives will do just fine.
We here talk to people at the summit, and you are at the summit of law. There's only two summits. There's the Supreme Court, and there's being the top attorney and law enforcement official of the United States federal government. And that's what you were. But the big issues go back to the Supreme Court. What you're doing now goes back to the court. Does the court have an ethics crisis at this point? You have written about proposals to reform it, term limits, adding justices, making it more truly democratic instead of this kind of odd way that some presidents get a lot more picks and, as you called it, skullduggery is rewarded. So what do you see today in that summit of the Supreme Court? Does it have a bigger ethics problem than it used to? Is it fixable?
I'm not sure I'd call it an ethics problem, although there are a couple of justices whose conduct I think can legitimately be questioned. But I certainly think that the court itself has a legitimacy problem, both in the way it was constructed, the things that Senate Republicans did to hold open a seat and then to rush through the nomination of another justice, and also the way in which the court has ruled. the law is governed by a number of things, precedent being maybe chief among them. This court has, when it wanted to, just ignored precedent, overturned decisions, the Roe decision being maybe the most prominent, and taken away rights from the people of the United States, which is a first. I mean, we are always trying to come up with ways in which we identify and grant rights to American citizens. This court took a substantial right away from people of this country.
So that's a little bit of what you're doing now, having been at the summit of American law. We also want to look at the other sides of you, because that's all very serious, and that's how many people know you. And yet,
Many people think I'm a stiff. I mean, what always strikes me is that I interact with people and say, "You're actually pretty funny," and I think, "Well, yeah, I think I'm a pretty humorous guy," and their only sense of me is what they saw at congressional hearings or when I was giving speeches about something. You know, there's a whole other dimension to me.
Well, there we go. Let's get into it. We want to go late night. Now, here on the Summit Series, it's maybe dusk, but we're actually going to go late night.
All right.
And remind people, there's this other holder. This is sometimes when you were hanging out on those shows. Let's take a look.
A criticism of me?
Yes, I'm going to be real quick, and I'm sure I'm 100% wrong. There were not...
I'm supposed to be your guest.
No, I know. That's why I was really nice to you up until now.
There are these things called facts, and then there's this other stuff.
I got to write that down. Facts?
Facts.
Facts? Okay, it's just been a while.
They still exist, you know?
Okay.
And then we found one peek of this in public that we wonder what it's really like in private, which is you giving your boss, President Obama, a hard time about what else, basketball. So we wonder what else happens when the cameras are off. Take a look.
I'm from New York City, the home of basketball players like Nate Tiny Archibald, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The president's from Hawaii. Now, I'm just saying that as background. He's a good ball player. He's still my boss. When I become a civilian, he will still have access to all things about me that, you know, that you all are worried about, I suppose, you know, that I will now be worried about.
Can you beat him one-on-one?
Certainly not now. I'm 10 years older than he is. I think it would have been a good match, you know.
Have you ever beat him one-on-one?
No, we've never played.
Okay, you don't play. So let's just give it. So what's the hardest time you give him when you guys are alone? About what topic?
Ooh, you know.
Prove you're not a stiff.
Probably about Chicago sports as opposed to New York sports. I mean, he's got this mistaken belief that, you know, Michael Jordan is the man as opposed to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, that the Bulls are better than the Knicks were at their height. You know, a whole range of Chicago athletic stuff, you know.
But you ever have anything, important or not, that you're like, he was wrong about and you remind him of that? Because I feel like when you have a real friendship and you're out of the hierarchy, that's one of the sweetest things. If I have an old buddy from Seattle and I've been proven right, you know, I'll bring that back 10 times.
You know, I don't know. I mean, we go at each other, we kid each other, you know, all the time. I'm not sure it's, you know, oftentimes it's me and him against our wives. I mean, you know, defending ourselves against charges about, you know, lack of attention. Where were you when I was raising babies? You guys were too much in your careers. And
I mean, if he says running the country, it's a partial answer.
Well, this is before he was running the country.
Well, then
he
there's
was a
no
state
answer.
senator and before I was attorney general. But,
okay,
you know,
well then...
They make a pretty formidable duo, and then the two of us do the best we can in counterpunching.
The role you've played as a barrier breaker, along with just being at that high level, seems to bring you into contact with you. You mentioned basketball. We got you and MJ and Kareem, which is interesting because you're around the White House, you're around the president. These things happen. We got you with Usher, you and Stevie, who, of course, has always been a voice. You talk about post-colonial liberation. He's been a voice on so many issues, from American civil rights to global and African issues. What does it mean to be at that level? And while you think about it, I decided here to bring you one set of lyrics, just one. But I wrote it down and everything. The president, as you know, got a big boost from Sean Carter, Jay-Z, and then paid it back. President Obama actually helped induct him into the Hall of Fame. And this is about leadership, but it's also about race, but it's in his words, and I thought it'd be interesting to run it by you. Do you know the song Murder to Excellence? Jay-Z says, black excellence, opulence, decadence. Tux is next to the president. I'm present. Success never smelled so sweet. I stink of success, the new black elite. They say my black card bears the mark of the beast. I repeat, my religion is the beat. My verse is like church, my Jesus peace. Now please, domino, domino, only spot a few blacks the higher I go. What up to Will, shout out to O, and I think that could be Obama or Oprah. But then he says, quote, that ain't enough. We're gonna need 1 million more. Kick in the door, Biggie Flow, I'm all dressed up with nowhere to go, which brings us back to the idea of him. Tux is next to the president, but how many people can get dressed up and get in that room? I'm curious just your reflection on that artistic reading of you there, being with some of the other people, but is it not enough people in the room, whether it's this grouping that he's talking about on race, whether it's about women, getting this country, which is supposed to be for everyone. But here we are, 2024, and he says it's not, and the numbers show it's not.
Right, and he's right. You know, the reality is one of the strengths of this nation is our diversity. When we don't focus on diversity, we leave pools of talent untapped. And given the nature of the problems that this country faces, we can't afford that. You know, the other thing I get
And do you ever feel like that in the room? Like you look around and go, wait a minute.
Sure. I mean, I was the first this, the first that, the first that, and always wonder, well, you know, where are the other folks who look like me? And we need to focus on that. I mean, this is ultimately the thing that I think will put this nation in a better place. When we value diversity, when we value differences, as opposed to using those implicit biases to look at somebody and to assume, well, he or she doesn't really deserve to be in the room. They're here for some reason other than the abilities that they have.
Right. Before I let you go, we got a lightning round. Everybody does this. The key to saving democracy is?
The key to saving democracy is focusing on the structures of our democracy. I've chosen to focus on gerrymandering. Make our democracy, our democratic institutions strong, and you will save our democracy.
What you'd say to someone who's young and looks at the system and says, I don't need to vote.
People died so that you would have the ability to vote. People committed themselves so that you would have opportunities that they did not. You, by your not voting, you dishonor their legacy. You dishonor their sacrifices. You dishonor the lives that they gave. And so it's not only a function of having an impact on your life now, it is also honoring those who came before you and sacrificed, and it is also the responsibility that you have to protect the future that is yet to come.
In one sentence, the worst thing about being Attorney General is?
Irrational, stupid, idiotic political opposition when you're coming up with solutions or answers to problems that any credible, reasonable person would say, yeah, well, that makes sense.
The best thing?
Working with the people, working on the policies, and having your own plane.
The best advice you've ever gotten?
From my father, a man who didn't graduate from high school and is, I think, maybe the wisest person I've ever known. He said, you never forget who you are. You never forget who you came from. Don't you let the big shots tell you what to do, how to do it. You be your own man. You have confidence in yourself. And you remember these words. And he put that at the end. You remember these words. And that has always stuck with me.
My music playlist must include?
David Ruffin and the Temptations.
Okay.
That's my man.
This is in a word or a sentence, but you can do one word. Bill Barr.
A disaster, an abomination, an embarrassment.
Merrick Garland.
A good guy, a good attorney general. He's still got a lot of heavy work in front of him.
President Obama.
The man. History is going to treat him quite well. A good friend and a great president.
President Biden.
A good guy, a good president, a person I've known for a great deal of time. History is going to be kind to him, but he's got some really difficult things to do in the next few years.
President Trump.
A real danger to our democracy, a person who can't become president again.
Final three. Failure means?
Failure means potentially not reaching your objectives, but failure also means that you can learn from that experience.
Success means?
Success means that you have reached an objective that you have set, but it can't give you too much comfort.
Reaching the summit means?
Getting to a place that you maybe only dreamed of, and having gotten to the summit, you have done something positive with the power that the summit has given you.
Attorney General Eric Holder, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.